was the early hours of December 29th, 2006. Inside a small prison cell, Saddam Hussein, once the most feared man in the Middle East, sat alone after spending years running from justice. His world had shrunk to a concrete room, dim lighting, and the sound of guards' boots in the hallway while he counted down his last moments. Saddam ruled Iraq from 1979 until 2003, but his legacy began long before that. His rise to power didn't come overnight. It was slow, calculated, and ruthless. As a young man in the 1960s, Saddam joined the Ba'ath Party, a movement built on Arab nationalism, promising strength, unity, and revival in a region long torn by colonialism and internal strife. But beneath those promises was something far more sinister. In 1968, the Ba'ath Party seized control of Iraq in a coup, and Saddam quickly climbed the ranks. Though not initially the president, he became the true power behind the scenes. He ran the intelligence services, crushed opponents, and turned the machinery of the state into a weapon. Assassinations, torture, and disappearances became routine tools of control. When he finally took the presidency in 1979, it wasn't through peaceful succession. It was through purges, fear, and executions of supposed traitors within his own party. Some of these executions were filmed and forced upon party members to watch as a warning to anyone who might defy him. From that moment, fear became the foundation of life in Iraq. It was woven into every part of society. People whispered in their own homes. Children were taught to praise Saddam from the first day of school. Teachers, doctors, and artists were all expected to be loyal, or at least appear to be. The walls had ears. Neighbors informed on neighbors. One wrong word could mean a late-night arrest, a blindfolded interrogation, and a disappearance that was never explained. Saddam's image dominated public life. Billboards showed him in military uniform, smiling or scowling, arms crossed like a father watching over his children. His face hung in every government office, in every school, even in homes, not out of love, but out of necessity. Not displaying his image was considered suspicious. Over time, he began to cultivate a cult of personality. He compared himself to great historical figures, posed as both a warrior and a poet, and released books under his name that Iraqis were required to read. Then came war, and with it, devastation. In 1980, Saddam launched a surprise attack on Iran, believing its new revolutionary government was weak. But what followed was one of the longest and deadliest conflicts of the 20th century. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years and consumed both nations. Saddam sent hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, many of them young, untrained conscripts, to fight and die. He authorized the use of chemical weapons, not only on Iranian soldiers, but on Iraqi Kurds suspected of siding with Iran. By the time the war ended, Iraq was economically drained and morally broken. Yet Saddam declared victory, celebrated in parades, and demanded more loyalty from a population too afraid to mourn. But the next disaster was already unfolding. In 1990, Saddam invaded Kuwait, hoping to seize its oil reserves and settle old disputes. He believed the West wouldn't intervene, but he was wrong. The U.S. and a coalition of 35 countries responded with Operation Desert Storm. In just over a month, Iraqi forces were driven out. The bombing campaign devastated Iraq's infrastructure, all reduced to rubble. What followed were years of crushing sanctions. For the Iraqi people, the 1990s were a nightmare. Food was rationed, medicine vanished from hospitals, malnutrition spread, child mortality soared. International reports warned of a humanitarian crisis, but Saddam lived untouched. He built opulent palaces, some with golden ceilings and private lakes, while his people suffered in silence. Inside the country, repression deepened. The 1988 Anfal campaign against the Kurds had already shown how far Saddam would go. Entire Kurdish villages were gassed, bulldozed, and erased from the map. Tens of thousands of civilians died. Survivors were deported or disappeared. Then came the 1991 Shia uprisings in the south, encouraged by U.S. broadcasts. Iraq's Shia population rose up, hoping for American support. But when that support never came, Saddam's forces responded with unspeakable brutality. Tanks rolled into cities like Karbala and Basra. Helicopters fired into crowds. Mass graves filled with bodies of men, women, even children. The regime hunted down anyone even suspected of rebellion. Torture centers operated in secret. Prisons overflowed. Families received death certificates with no explanation. By the time the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, Saddam vanished without a trace. As Baghdad collapsed under heavy bombardment and U.S. troops marched through the capital, his statues were torn down by cheering crowds. But Saddam himself was nowhere to be found. In those early days, many believed he had fled the country. Some thought he was dead, but American intelligence believed otherwise. The hunt for Saddam became a top priority, a mission known as Operation Red Dawn. For months, U.S. forces raided homes, interrogated former regime members, and followed every lead. His sons, Uday and Qusay, were killed in a firefight in Mosul in July 2003. Still, Saddam remained at large. He was constantly on the move, using loyal tribal networks to stay hidden in safe houses across central Iraq. He communicated through couriers, avoided all electronic devices, and relied on disguises. But by late 2003, U.S. forces had narrowed their search to a rural area near his hometown of Tikrit. On December 13, 2003, after a tip from a captured bodyguard, U.S. troops from the 4th Infantry Division and Special Operations Forces surrounded a remote farmhouse outside the village of Ad-Dawr. In the yard, they found a small concealed hole in the ground, roughly 6 feet deep, and barely large enough for a man to lie in. Inside it was Saddam Hussein. He was pulled from the dirt-covered spider hole, looking wary and defeated. His beard was long and unkempt. His clothes were filthy. He carried a pistol but never reached for it. At that moment, he surrendered without a fight. The footage of his capture was broadcast around the world. It was a moment few could have imagined. A U.S. soldier even checked his hair and mouth for lice. From that day forward, Saddam was held in U.S. custody, leading to his trial and execution. The prison was cold, and the walls seemed to trap the stillness. There was no clock in his cell, but time felt heavy. Lights stayed on through the night, and the air carried the weight of something permanent. Guards monitored him constantly through a small window and cameras, but interaction was limited. No one gave away when it would happen, but Saddam could feel it in the silence. His routine was simple: a small meal, a few short walks in the corridor under tight watch, and long hours of just sitting, thinking. By this point, Saddam was no longer the powerful president of Iraq. He had lost weight, his face had aged, and his once black beard had turned white. His movements were slower now, his hands often folded in his lap. Still, even in this stripped-down state, he kept a calm posture. He didn't cry or yell, he just waited. He had asked for a Quran in the days before, and he spent time reading it quietly. He didn't speak much, unless directly spoken to. Sometimes he stood for long periods as if trying to remind himself who he once was. His pride hadn't left him completely. It showed in how he sat, how he walked, how he looked at the guards. His trial started on November 5th, 2006, in which he was sentenced to death by hanging. The trial had focused on one major case: the massacre of 148 men and boys in the Shiite town of Dujail in 1982. That attack had been ordered after a failed assassination attempt on Saddam. The court ruled that his response was not only brutal, but illegal under both Iraqi and international law. The decision came after nearly a year of hearings and witness testimonies. When the verdict was read, it sealed Saddam's fate. Still, under Iraqi law, even a death sentence had to go through one last step: an appeal. His lawyers filed it immediately, hoping to delay or overturn the decision, but the process moved fast. On December 26, 2006, the appeal was officially denied. That same day, Iraqi President Jalal Talabani and Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's office quickly signed off on the execution order. There was no press release, no announcement. Only a few people knew that the final decision had been made. Now it wasn't a question of if, but when. By December 29th, word had started to spread behind the scenes. Some international news agencies caught hints of what was coming, but the Iraqi government refused to confirm anything. American and Iraqi officials began working closely together to coordinate the next steps. The U.S. military still technically had custody of Saddam, but Iraqi law stated that Iraqi hands must carry out the execution. That meant the Americans had to turn him over, carefully and quickly. This wasn't just a legal step. It was also a major security risk. The country was still unstable, and many Iraqis still supported Saddam. Some tribal groups and former Ba'ath Party loyalists had already made threats. The fear was that news of his execution might trigger mass protests, riots, or even full-blown attacks. Every move had to be calculated. Despite those concerns, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was determined to move forward. He believed the execution needed to happen before the end of the year, and that waiting would only increase the risk of unrest. So the preparations began. Troop movement, guard changes, legal paperwork, and last-minute coordination, all happening behind closed doors. Around 8 p.m. on December 29th, Iraqi officials arrived at Camp Cropper, the heavily secured U.S. military facility near Baghdad International Airport. This was where Saddam Hussein had been kept under American control. It was calm, but tense. The handover was quiet and quick. U.S. personnel followed strict orders. They confirmed Saddam's identity, documented the transfer, and then formally handed him over to the Iraqi government. Just before 9 p.m., Saddam was escorted out of Camp Cropper and taken to Camp Justice, a separate Iraqi-run military base located in the Qadimiyya district of Baghdad. This facility was known for conducting executions, and it was where Saddam's life would end. By the time he arrived at Camp Justice, he was placed in a holding room. It was small and bare, meant only for short stays. Guards stood outside, and Iraqi officials began preparing the necessary legal steps. The room was under tight surveillance. Cameras were set up to record the entire process, from the moment of the transfer to the final moments on the gallows. This wasn't meant for the public, but for the official record, a way to prove everything had followed procedure. The execution wasn't just a punishment, it was a legal requirement. According to Iraqi law, the hanging had to take place within 30 days of the final ruling. Since the verdict was upheld on December 26th, the absolute deadline was December 30th. That gave officials only a narrow window to act, and because Iraq uses a different calendar for official business, there was even some confusion about how much time was left. But the government had decided the hanging would take place just hours after the transfer. In those early nighttime hours, final preparations were made, witnesses were called, legal paperwork was reviewed and signed. The wooden gallows had already been inspected earlier that day. Everything was being done quickly, but carefully. The guards at Camp Justice remained alert. Outside, Baghdad was still under curfew. Inside, time was moving fast. Saddam was handed a clean set of clothes, a plain white shirt, and a dark coat. It was a formal outfit, meant to maintain dignity in his final moments. He changed without protest. His hands were then tied, not tightly, but securely, to prevent any sudden movement. A small group had gathered inside the execution chamber. There was a judge, assigned to oversee the legal side of the process. A prosecutor was present, along with senior Iraqi officials who were there to witness and confirm that the execution was carried out properly. A few guards stood nearby, silent but focused. Also in the room was a religious cleric, someone brought in for the spiritual part of the process. Iraqi law required that the condemned be offered religious guidance before the sentence was carried out. Despite what was happening, Saddam stayed calm. He didn't show signs of panic or fear. His posture remained straight, and he followed instructions without resistance. Witnesses later said he even appeared confident, not smiling, not relaxed, but composed. He didn't argue or make a scene. One request he did make was for a personal copy of the Quran. He held it tightly in both hands and read from it quietly to himself. No one interrupted him. There were no conversations, no debates. The room stayed quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy. Outside the building, the rest of the base remained on alert, but inside, the atmosphere was controlled and serious. As the hour moved closer to midnight, Saddam declined food and water. He hadn't eaten much that day anyway. His last meal had been offered earlier in the afternoon, but he barely touched it. There were no last words requested from him. He didn't ask to contact anyone. Just after midnight, on December 30th, 2006, the legal deadline had passed only moments earlier, and now the Iraqi government was moving forward with one of the most significant executions in modern Middle Eastern history. It was officially the first day of Eid al-Adha, one of the holiest celebrations in Islam. Across Iraq, families were preparing for prayers and gatherings. But here, in a quiet building inside Camp Justice, another kind of event was unfolding. The timing deeply unsettled many Iraqis. To carry out an execution on a sacred day felt wrong, even offensive to some. Religious leaders had urged the government to wait, but Nouri al-Maliki was firm. Inside the execution room, final checks were completed. At the center stood a wooden platform raised off the ground, with a trapdoor beneath. Above it, a thick rope hung down, the noose that would be used. The room had been used for executions before, but never for someone of Saddam's status. Saddam was led into the chamber by 2 Iraqi guards. His posture was steady. He walked with firm steps. A black cloth was draped around his neck to prevent bruising after death. The noose was placed over his head and tightened around his neck. His hands were still tied, and he was holding his Quran in one hand. He gave it to a guard, asking that it be passed on to someone later. There were around 14 official witnesses standing nearby. They had been carefully selected. The cameras kept rolling, and by the early morning hours of December 30th, 2006, the long wait was coming to an end. At exactly 6 a.m. Baghdad time, the signal was given. The execution team opened the trapdoor beneath him. In an instant, he dropped. The noose snapped tight. His body hung still. The entire process lasted less than a minute. It was over fast. There were no cries, no last outbursts, no interruptions. It was quiet. A doctor immediately stepped forward to check his body. He felt for a pulse, examined his breathing, and confirmed there were no signs of life. Saddam Hussein was declared dead on the spot. It was done. The death sentence had been carried out exactly as ordered by the Iraqi court. The officials in the room didn't cheer or speak. It was a somber moment. Some of the witnesses quietly stepped back. Others simply watched, still processing what had just taken place. Following the execution, Saddam's body was carefully taken down from the platform. Guards handled the remains with a formal, procedural approach. His body was wrapped in a white shroud, following Islamic burial customs, and then placed inside a plain wooden coffin. There were no markings, no official symbols, no grand display. For a man who had once surrounded himself with gold-plated palaces and military parades, it was a quiet and stripped-down end. By mid-morning, U.S. military vehicles began the transport. The body was moved under tight security from Camp Justice in Baghdad to the town of Tikrit, Saddam's birthplace. Tikrit had always been a loyal area for Saddam. Many in the region still supported him, and the tribal connections remained strong. His family, particularly members of the Albu Nasir tribe, had requested the body for a proper burial. The Iraqi and American authorities approved the handover without hesitation. They knew it was important to avoid further tension. Giving his tribe the body was seen as a way to keep order and prevent more unrest. By Saturday afternoon, Saddam was quietly buried in Al-Auja, a small village just outside Tikrit. The burial site was near a mosque he had ordered to be built years earlier during his time in power. The building was one of many he had commissioned in an effort to link his rule with religion and Iraqi identity. Now it became his final resting place. The burial was simple A handful of people were present, mostly close family and tribal elders. There was no public view, but news of the burial spread quickly. Before long, crowds began to gather outside the mosque. Some people stood silently, showing respect. Others cried and prayed. But the reaction wasn't the same across Iraq. In Shia-majority cities, like Baghdad's Sadr city, or in the south of Iraq, people celebrated. Some fired guns into the air. Others handed out sweets in the streets. For them, the hanging of Saddam Hussein marked the end of a dark chapter. But in the Sunni-majority areas, especially in central Iraq, it was a different story. Some people mourned. Saddam, to many in those regions, had been a symbol of strength, someone who had kept order, even through fear. By the afternoon of December 30th, protests had already begun. In Samarra and parts of Anbar province, crowds blocked roads, burned tires, and shouted slogans in support of Saddam. Some carried his photos. Others demanded revenge. And before the sun set, the violence had already started. Improvised explosive devices went off in some areas. Armed groups clashed with security forces. There were reports of gunfire in Baquba and Fallujah. The Iraqi government quickly addressed the public. Officials said the execution was necessary, legal, and long overdue. They framed it as a turning point, a way to finally move forward after years of chaos. But not everybody believed that. For some Iraqis, it felt more like the start of another wave of conflict. Outside Iraq, the reaction was just as split. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International, questioned whether the trial had been truly fair. Others said the rushed timing, especially during Eid al-Adha, showed a lack of respect. Even some international allies of Iraq, like officials in the European Union, said the execution might make reconciliation harder. It wasn't over yet. Shortly after the execution, a mobile phone video was leaked. Someone in the room had secretly recorded the hanging. The footage quickly spread online and caused outrage. The video showed Saddam being mocked by some guards before the noose was tightened. The Iraqi government promised an investigation, but the damage was done. The leaked clip changed how many people saw the event. Instead of a formal legal process, it looked like revenge. Some called it a political lynching. Others said it would only increase sectarian tensions. The moment that was supposed to close a chapter had now opened wounds. In the years after Saddam's death, Iraq continued to struggle. Violence between Sunni and Shia groups worsened. Al-Qaeda in Iraq gained strength. Later, ISIS rose up from the chaos, taking control of large areas by 2014. The dream of stability seemed far away. Many Iraqis blamed the U.S. invasion for destroying the country's foundation. Others blamed Saddam's long dictatorship for the deep divisions. Either way, his death didn't fix things. In fact, for some, it made things more unstable. Even today, people debate whether Saddam's execution helped Iraq or hurt it more.